Ruben Schwartz here from Sales for Nerds, kicking off the Sales for Nerds podcast. If you feel more comfortable with SQL than sales calls, more at home writing test suites than proposals, more interested in crunching numbers than shaking hands, if you think networking should be about routers rather than cocktails with strangers, if you're more interested in debating code editors than negotiating deals, but somehow you ended up responsible for some of those sales and marketing activities, this is the podcast for you.
Today, I'm super excited to have Scott Ingram on the Sales for Nerds podcast. Scott is the host of the Sales Success Stories podcast, which I've been listening to. And of course, there's lots of sales podcasts out there. But one thing I love about this, aside from Scott being a super helpful guy in general, is how specific he gets with his interview guests and how you get some really great tactical advice. And Scott, in fact, has agreed to be on the show here, not only to talk about sales, but also to give me some very tactical advice about podcasting. So thanks and welcome, Scott.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
And Scott had requested a fairly full-bodied red. So today we have a Hawks View California Syrah from 2011.
Fantastic. This is the most important part of the show.
It absolutely is. Now let's see how this tastes, because I opened it up a few hours ago. Works for me.
That'll do.
Cheers. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, one of the things I noticed, a serious problem with this podcast is we pop open the wine, and then depending on what kind of wine it is, it may not start tasting good till we're wrapping up. So I wanted to give this one a chance to breathe. I didn't decant it or anything. I just uncorked it and let it sit there on the counter for a little while. So hopefully that'll help. I did actually go to the trouble of reading some reviews of this one saying you might want to let the pepper settle down a little bit before you really start drinking this. And as usual, this would just go so nicely with some steak or some lamb or something that we don't have with us. But anyway,
it goes just as well with conversation.
All right. Well, let's hope so. Scott, tell me, how did you get into sales? Because I'm guessing that when you started out, you did not envision that down the road you'd be hosting the Sales Success podcast.
Yeah, probably not. It's not the thing that you talk about in third grade when you're thinking about what you want to be when you grow up. My dream of being a professional basketball player didn't pan out so well. Turns out I'm white and 5'10". So
you suffer from the same problems I do. That's why we're here podcasting.
and I'm no Larry Bird. So I started my first company when I was 20. I started an IT consulting company, and we were doing small business networks and kind of infrastructure, things like that. And it turns out it's really hard to have a successful company if you don't have any clients. So for me, where the sales adventure began really was with that, and having to go and develop my own business and build that business. And a lot of things kind of went into that. I was very fortunate and quickly found a lot of mentors through some experiences that I had in high school. Where I had been invited by the local Chamber of Commerce to participate in a Students in Business Day. I kind of figured, well, there are a lot of business people at the Chamber of Commerce. Maybe I should go there. Some things looked like they happened there. And when you're 20 years old and you walk into a meeting, the Chamber of Commerce is typically not made up of 20-year-olds. I very quickly got adopted by a lot of really great people who took me under their wing and taught me an awful lot, to the point where most of that early business development really came through a lot of that type of community involvement. Within a couple of years, I was on the board of the chamber and the chair of building that same Student in Business Day that had brought me into the fold. And they taught me a lot about relationship building and growing a business and building sales. And that's really how it all started.
Now, how did you decide to start a business at age 20? That's not a typical move.
Yeah, that was also an accident. So I have always been a bit of a computer nerd. So I did I'm going to date myself here, but I'm sure a lot of your audience will hopefully associate. I did a lot of the bulletin board system, kind of pre-internet stuff. My first internet account I accessed through a 1200 baud dial-up and was logging into a Unix shell account where I would use Pine to email my friends who had moved on to college while I was still in high school.
Oh, Pine, that was the thing.
That did it.
That was slick.
Not the greatest UI. So from there, sort of the natural path in those days would have been, oh, well, you go to college and you get a computer science degree. I'm not quite as good on the math side of things.
Okay.
And so obviously the math requirement and load for that was rather high. And I thought, I don't know. And so I was sort of a typical 18 or 19-year-old at the time, not knowing what I wanted to be when I grew up. So I thought, you know what, let me save the money and not spend $20,000, $30,000 a year to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. And I was in California at the time and just kind of went through the community college system and figured, I'll just kind of get some general ed going and figure this out. And that was about the point that I discovered computer networking, and then sort of went down the certification path, and I was a Microsoft certified systems engineer, and for some odd reason it became irrelevant. It was already relevant when I did it, but I became a certified Novell administrator. I'm not sure what I was thinking. And that's kind of where it started. And again, it was kind of that same idea of, okay, well, now what I do, and the promise back in those days, the way they sold all of that training was, well, once you're certified, you go out and you get your $50,000 a year job. And I thought, oh, that sounds great. Well, then you apply for their jobs and like, well, where's your 3 to 5 years of experience? Shoot. And it really was just sort of a relational accident. We had a family friend that worked in the school district that I had attended as a child. And she said, our IT department is looking for some help. Let me introduce you to the CIO of the school district. And we got together and he's like, yeah, I actually need a consultant. You could consult for us. I said, okay, sure. And he asked me, it was a funny story. He asked me what my rates were. I'm like, I don't know, $25 an hour. And he's like, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. Why don't you and I have lunch tomorrow? So you'll notice there's a long history of mentors. In the early days, many of them accidental, but now something I really try and cultivate. And so we had lunch and he's like, look, I just came from consulting. Let me explain to you how this works and how self-employment taxes work and how you're going to give up more than half of everything I pay you. So I said, oh, okay. So like $125 an hour. He says, yes, that's correct. You're now hired. I'm like, okay, great. So that's where it started. He actually referred me to a couple of other friends that had been clients of his when he'd had his consulting company before he'd taken on this role. And that's how it really started. So it was very, very accidental, but very fun and led to a lot of great things. I ran that company for 5 years, grew it to a pretty good point. And then in 2004, I kind of saw what was coming with the real estate market in California and cashed out of everything. So I sold the company, sold my condo, and we've been in Austin for the last, whatever that is, 12, 14 years ever since.
Okay. So after you sort of have this initial serendipitous encounter where you not only have the buyer who wants to hire you, but helps you quintuple your rates to a living rate, which is fantastic. How do you then go and how do you start building out your sales skills, your marketing skills, if that was applicable? What happened next? Because I feel like you have a very interesting intro, and then you're like, and then it was all,
yeah, sure. There's a few steps in between. I think it was just a lot of trial and error in the early days. Most of it, I again benefited throughout from just a lot of good relationships. I did good work, and so that helped a lot. But that pretty quickly plateaued, right? That you can only ride that relationship referral wave so far before it kind of peters out. And that's about the point that I think I discovered Sandler. So I became a student of Sandler in the very early days. And that helped a lot. And I think that it's so interesting. We've been having this conversation a lot around the Sales Success Stories podcast in terms of what sales philosophy or sales process people follow, and was just on another great podcast called the Salesman Podcast. And Will was asking about, is it the specific system or process, or is it just the fact that you have a process?
Right.
And I think it's really the latter, but it's go find one that's pre-built, right? Trying to invent it and learn it from scratch is a very, very, very long and painful road. So I think you have to start with one that's going to give you that baseline foundation. And then it's kind of like jazz, right? First, learn how to read the sheet of music, then improvise.
Right.
So that's kind of how that started.
So for people who want some more background on Sandler, if you haven't heard of it, go back and on episode 3, Adam Boyd from Sandler talks about that. And one thing he mentions is, he likes the Sandler process for obvious reasons, and he can explain why he thinks it's better than something else. But he says, just for God's sake, have a process and don't invent it yourself. It doesn't have to be this one. Just have something. Another totally random aside, when I was in college, after I graduated from the dining hall work study to you can do stuff with computers work study, I had a job administering a small Novell network. Not that I knew anything about it. It would have been really helpful to be certified, but I could read a book and somehow manage to keep all the computers talking to each other. So as you grow and you build your company, you get some good word of mouth. You're able to go close these deals. You make it sound really easy. Once you figured out that you weren't supposed to charge $25 an hour, what hit you next? I'm guessing there was something that wasn't just, money coming out of the trees.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is the prospecting side of things. I think I've always had a fairly natural ability on the sales side, perhaps because I don't follow any of the stereotypes. And I think that's a really dangerous trap. I think we have this fear of sales because we have a misconception about what sales really is. And my approach to sales, I try to make as natural as possible. Mm-hmm. And it's just a conversation. It's just two people. We're trying to understand each other. And my job is to do more understanding than they are initially, to kind of figure that out. So the hardest part, I think, for most people, almost anybody in sales, is the prospecting side and finding those new conversations to have.
Right. And I think it kind of ties together. If you have conversations with good prospects, that seems really easy. If you're trying to hammer the wrong peg into the wrong hole because you don't have a good match with your prospects, it's discouraging. It's really hard work. You're always stressed out. People seem to dislike you. There's sort of this natural notion of now you're trying to manipulate them because, gosh, you've got to close something this quarter, mm-hmm. and so on and so forth. But if you can bring in the right audience, then those conversations are relatively easy. You're not going to close 100% of them, but at least they're a good conversation, and it's natural that you should have it. And if they become a customer, great. If they don't, it's easy to refer and have a good relationship that might be helpful later.
Yeah. Well, and just listening to your last episode on the way here, I'm a huge proponent and believer in this idea of being niche and not being all things to all people and being very, very specific on who you worked with. And back in that first company, it took me a while to get there, but I was able to get very specific in terms of it was a very narrow geography in Orange County. It was a very specific size of organization. It was a small handful of different industries where I knew that we could have the most value. And then when you're having those kinds of conversations, and in my day job today, right? So the podcast is not my primary operandi. I am a strategic account manager for a kind of a mid-size consulting firm, and we work exclusively with the Oracle Marketing Cloud, which kind of grew out of. I worked for Eloqua kind of before their IPO and through the IPO and their eventual Oracle acquisition. Actually, I was chuckling walking up here. We used to have an office in this building. It took me a while to realize where I was. That again, it's very, very specific, and I think it changes the competitive conversation. Mm-hmm. When you're competing with a bunch of people, we do that versus this is the only thing we do. I have the thing you're trying to solve for right now. I have done 100 times in the last 3 years. Right, just that level of credibility and the experience that you bring, especially around services. because it's interesting being back in services. For the last number of years, I've been selling SaaS. I've been selling software. And so to have come full circle back into services, I'm sort of back in this position of helping people understand that an hour is not an hour.
Right.
That is not an apples to apples comparison, especially when it comes to niche experience.
Right. And I don't know how many times I've had issues with hourly rates to the point that I stopped doing hourly rates. Because if you can really do that job 10x cheaper, I think you absolutely should. And I've seen enough clients try to do that and end up really frustrated because they not only wasted the money, they wasted a ton of time and didn't get things done. And like you say, if you have a niche, you can say, hey, you know what? It would be better for you to offload this portion of the project to these folks. They'll do a great job for what you need on that piece, and they're cheaper, and you'll be happy, and so on, and we can spend that money more strategically over here. But you can't do that if you don't have a niche, if you don't have a position.
Yeah. Well, and the model that I eventually landed on with the original company, and actually the original company, funny story, was called Gray Matter Technologies. And a few years ago, I got into Breaking Bad.
I was going to bring that up.
Yeah, that was quite a surprise. Too bad I let that domain name go. Well, I sold it, so it wasn't mine anymore. Anyway, the way that I would start that relationship is somebody would come in and say, oh, look, we need somebody to either set up our network or manage our network or whatever the case was. And I would basically sit down in that first conversation and say, look, if anybody else comes in here and is able to write you a proposal based on an hour-long conversation, it's basically malpractice. What's going to happen is they're going to discover all sorts of, well, we didn't know about that, and the scope and everything else is going to be 3 times as much. It's going to be absolutely ridiculous. So the only thing I was trying to sell them in kind of that initial conversation was $1,000 discovery process. And I said, look, let me reduce the risk for you and make this really easy. Let's do this really tiny project together. I'll come in, we'll audit everything. We'll get a great understanding of what you're trying to do, what your current systems look like. That way we're not going to get surprised by anything. Mm-hmm. You'll have an opportunity to work with us through that process. So if you decide you don't like us, that's cool. We're going to give you basically the RFP that you now can take to everybody else and say, look, this is everything that we've got. This is everything we need. But that never happened, right? We'd go through that process. We're the only ones that, and so it was, again, just completely different set of positioning. I wasn't asking for $50,000 after an hour-long conversation, right? It was a very, very small bite. It was the beginning of a relationship, and it worked extraordinarily well.
Well, it's kind of like what you said at the beginning, where I had the same problem where I had this misconception of sales. It was all the sort of the used car salesman or the enterprise software salesman, whatever you want to look at it as someone who was basically playing games against the buyer. And there are some certain, I think, sales negotiations where it literally is a game between especially when you get procurement involved, but for the most part, it's not, right? It's like people are trying to solve a problem. Are you helping them get there or not? And so many people want to say, well, I want the $50,000 contract, but that's not reasonable to ask for at that stage. It's reasonable to say, how about we figure out what the heck's going on here and do the $1,000 assessment? And then, like you say, you say, if I were you, I would want the option to bid this out to whoever I want. It makes it so easy for them. And what do you know? You go and close, and the people trying to do the hard sell don't make it.
Exactly. And I think the further away you can get from car salesmen, I mean, the reason there's such an aversion to sales in general, I think, is because we've had bad sales experiences.
Right.
The flip side is it's very hard to recall good sales experiences because it didn't feel like you were being sold to. So you don't really think of it as, oh, wait, that was a sales process.
Right. It's like Matthew Pollard said on the last episode, people hate to be sold to, but they love to buy.
Absolutely.
And if you get in the way and you make it a sales process, you get all the resistance. But if you make it a buying process, then you're in good shape. And of course...
Yeah, and I think you need to think of it as we're helping people buy.
Right.
Yeah, and so one of the most common themes that I'm really starting to hear, the focus of my show And the domain name kind of says it all. It's top1.fm. So we try and talk to folks that you're either the number one salesperson in an organization, or if they're in a very large organization, in the top 1%. And one of the most common themes, actually, there are a surprising number of women in that position. So women are obviously a minority in sales roles, but they are overly represented in the top ranks. And I've been talking with them and asking them, why the heck is this? And it really seems to come down to, one, this deep level of empathy and curiosity, and they're just interested and they care and they want to understand. They also care, and this is another big sales trap, they care about what happens and the result, not the close. The close is just the beginning. Right. That's where it starts. And that's where we have to start to deliver the solution, even if, a lot of the people that I know in sales, and I've been in this role a lot of times myself, once the deal is closed, I hand it off and somebody else has to deliver it. I'm not really involved. But I think it's important to continue to be involved. And that theme and that area of consistency is wanting to feel and know that what I'm delivering to the client is going to make a difference and is going to help them and is going to provide value, and not, well, this is what I have to sell. Right. So dang it, I'm going to sell it even if it's maybe not the quite. So I hate the analogy of like, oh, that guy could sell ice to Eskimos.
Right.
Really? Now, I've heard some pretty good counter stories to that, to where there are some reasons why Eskimos might actually need ice, but that's a whole different topic.
You mentioned, I was curious also about sort of the I don't know if unexpected is the right word, but disproportionate number of women in the top performers when they're so dramatically underrepresented compared to population. And I think a lot of the reasons you've got, I mean, they sound very plausible to me. And I know that HubSpot did some research on this because they built up a pretty big sales team, and of course they have tools to track them. And they were trying to figure out, when they were trying to hire people, who are we supposed to hire? And when they looked at their data, they found that what they thought they were supposed to hire, sort of the archetypal gung-ho, nothing against football players, but sort of like the captain of the football player.
Yeah, it's total type A jock. Yeah.
Right. Like that was not it. That those people could be successful, but sort of that personality was slightly negatively correlated with sales success. And the things that correlated most with success were conscientiousness and curiosity and basically caring about the customer. And it seems so obvious, but I think to me, that was the biggest thing that I had to get over with my own self, because I had been the sort of the technical guy on the receiving end of people who had closed deals and walked away. And so I hated sales. And they weren't necessarily doing anything wrong. A lot of this was sort of bad game theory, where the buyer was trying to reduce risk so much, they ended up increasing risk, if that makes sense.
Totally.
And so, it fell on us tech people to deliver this stuff into a buyer who had boxed us into this trap where we couldn't deliver the maximum value because everything was so boxed in and it wasn't truly collaborative. But once I sort of got over figuring out, hey, you don't have to sell that way, and you don't have to pick a market where that's necessary. What if you could pick a market where you can just go help people? Then it sort of stops becoming sales.
So not to maybe paint the wrong stereotype of what I assume your audience to be, but one thing that I would assume that they may find valuable is not just the prominence of women in the top ranks, but how often I run into more introverted type personalities. And what's interesting, very few people think this of me. In fact, they challenge me on it. I actually tend ever so slightly more towards introversion than I do extroversion. So I play extrovert very, very well. But my natural tendencies are a bit more introverted. And I think that similar reasons, right, around the empathy is the introvert operates better one-on-one and in smaller, more familiar environments. And I mean, especially folks with a technical background, caring about and thinking through the details that stuff matters, right? And being able to be a good partner. When I think of the way that I sell also, it's really a partnering. It's something that we do together. It's not something I do to somebody.
Right.
So we're working towards a goal, and at some point kind of a contract is part of that process, but there's much bigger things that we're trying to do together. And anytime that you can bring insights and value, the other kind of resource, or I can't call it methodology really, that comes up a lot after Sandler or with Sandler, is the Challenger Sale by Corporate Executive Board. And it's an interesting book. I think it gets misunderstood by a lot of people. If you're going to read it, you have to actually read the whole thing. Don't read the first part. I think a lot of people have read that book and gotten into this trap of thinking, oh, I just need to be a jerk. That's not the customer experience people are looking for. But what they are looking for is somebody who is going to be square with them and challenge assumptions and ideas and push them, even though that can sometimes be pretty uncomfortable.
Well, it's funny because you're looking straight at me saying you have to read the whole thing. And I started reading that book and I actually stopped because I don't want to be a jerk. I spent so much time getting over the notion that salespeople were jerks, but maybe I should go back and read the second half and really understand what they're talking about. Yeah.
And again, the reason I can't fully recommend it is because it's not really a process. It doesn't give you any type of prescription or explain the steps. And it's not at all exclusively sales. That is really a sales and marketing book.
Okay.
And there are big elements of that you either need to incorporate marketing if it's a hat that you also wear, or involve your marketing team, because it's really digging deep and understanding and coming up with those insights that you can bring to clients. And it is not strictly a sales thing. So it's a very tough. I've seen a lot of organizations sort of try to implement that and completely fall on their face. It's not an easy thing to do, but I do think it's an interesting thing to understand from a perspective standpoint. And it does come up pretty regularly with the folks that I'm talking to who are having extraordinary success.
They say that book has helped them.
Well, help them, or they describe it as yep, that's my style.
Got it.
Right. I identify with that, and that kind of connects.
And maybe I'm understanding the book wrong based on reading a few chapters late at night before I fall asleep, because I kind of got that impression that you were talking about, and I shut the book. But it seems like where I think he was trying to go is bring a different perspective that's actually going to help the customer grow and introduce them to something they didn't know, as opposed to just, here's a brochure for the stuff that I think you might possibly want to buy.
Yeah. And it's about educating and sort of bringing them along and positioning those different things. So it's powerful, but I find it to be more dangerous than a lot of other things where, if applied wrong, you're probably not gonna screw it up. And Challenger, I think, is one where you absolutely can.
Now, you also have a really deep marketing background, right? You did a marketing podcast. You do marketing for your day job.
I don't do marketing for my day job. I do sales for my day job, but for the last, going back to my time at Bizarre Voice in, I don't even know what year that was, 2010 maybe. Since then, I have sold exclusively to marketers and worked with marketers. So it's something I love. I really, really enjoy. And obviously the idea of sales and marketing alignment has become more and more prominent. And I like to feel like I embody that. I'm often kind of the glue between the sales department and the marketing department in the roles that I've held. And I actually host a podcast called Inspired Marketing for my company, and we talk to people that are using Eloqua and the Oracle Marketing Cloud and being successful. And it's a lot kind of like the sales thing. I have very similar themes. I think people want to hear from those who are actually doing it, right? Mm-hmm. It's my whole issue, especially with the sales podcast, is nearly all of the sales content out there comes from these quote unquote sales experts.
Right.
and they haven't sold anything but themselves in years and oftentimes decades.
Mm-hmm.
And sales is evolving quite rapidly right now. Like the tools, just there's a lot of movement in terms of what is and isn't working in sales. And I figure that's silly. Why don't we go find out from the people who are actually doing it right now in this environment and having a lot of success? Let's go find out what they're doing.
Right. And I think especially for this audience, it's a useful concept because, it's one thing to say, gosh, I've been selling for 20 years or 10 years or whatever, and I'm ready to take my game to the next level. So I'm going to go work with this guru and get even better. It's another thing if you're saying, gosh, I'm not really a salesperson, but I have to go sell. What are some of these people going out there and doing tactically today? And some of the folks on your podcast are not longtime salespeople. And they're obviously dedicated, they're professional and so on and so forth, but they've kind of figured out the stuff that they need to be doing on a daily basis. And they go out there and they do it, and then they describe it on your podcast, which is awesome.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one thing, and I think especially for your audience, that's important to understand, especially when it just comes to the sales experts and the different methodologies and processes out there. The other theme that is extraordinarily consistent is just how consistent these top sellers are, meaning they sell. And the way that they operate in that role is who they are.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, okay, well, I have to put on this really weird persona that is not me. They operate from who they are. And the range of who these people are that I've talked with is really, really broad. So I think you need to kind of look at yourself and find, if you are going to seek out a guru or a methodology or some other type of content like that, find something that you yourself can identify with and doesn't feel like a big stretch for you, because I think that's where we get really led astray, right? If we think, well, what it's going to take for me to be successful in sales is to be that super type A jock personality,
mm-hmm.
and you try to be that when you're not,
right?
That it's just a mess.
Pick a strategy that's going to play to your strengths, not
exactly.
something that requires you to be someone different.
That was better said than me.
I don't know. Trying to work on this myself, but
I'll drink to that.
So, you've had the chance to talk to a lot of people over the years, and especially on your podcast, and authenticity keeps coming up. What else kind of comes up again and again as, gosh, that's kind of interesting. Maybe we should be thinking about this when we think about sales success.
Yeah, that's really the next project for me, and I've been working on it at some degree, is really just understanding what are the themes, what are the consistent elements that we see through this. I mean, we've definitely talked through a few of them, right? There's absolutely a process. There's authenticity to it. There is a level of caring and empathy and commitment. There's also, it's probably two other things. And what's funny about this is, it must just be human nature. I think we seek out the super advanced magic bullet, like there's going to be this amazing magical thing that's going to get this done. You'll notice everything I'm going to talk about and everything I have talked about is really, really fundamental and basic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really coming to believe that is the key. Just like the best football teams focus on, these are professionals who have spent their lives playing football or playing at the highest level, or any sport. I choose your favorite sport.
Basketball, like our former NBA careers.
Right. If you look at that practice and what they're doing and what they're focusing on, the majority of that time is spent on fundamentals.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same is absolutely true of sales. And there's a couple of other things that are coming up with a lot of consistency. One is a desire to learn and educate themselves. And I'd actually say that is less about learning about sales and more learning about their industry, their solution, their customers. Psychology is another one that kind of comes up. So they're not really seeking out like, I've got to read every sales book that's out there. I think a lot of these folks are kind of recognizing like that's not where the value is. And like being the best at almost everything, following what everybody else does is not usually a recipe to being the very best, right? You've got to kind of find a different way. So there's really that drive and that thirst for knowledge and curiosity, but it's much more broad-based than just sales techniques, if you will. The other is a level of organization and planning and ritual and all of those things. And I have found for myself, that's probably one of the things that I feel like makes the biggest difference in just some of the habits and routines that I've put in place that allow me to be consistent and follow up and build trust and just be effective and efficient in the way that I operate on a day-to-day basis.
So to borrow a technique from one of the podcasts I like to listen to, it's called, I believe, Sales Success Stories. What are some of those rituals? Because I think that's the thing. People say, yeah, I should totally have rituals. What should they be?
Yeah. So I've finally learned where I typically start this question with my guests is I ask about their morning routine. I have very recently learned, based on my last interview, the question I have to ask before that is, are you a morning person or a night owl?
Right.
Because what I find is if they're a night owl, they're like, morning routine? Are you kidding me? So I'm a morning person. I'm a ridiculous morning person, and I get up at 4:30 or 5 o'clock, depending on the day. And I work out. That's kind of the first thing I do 6 days a week. I don't get up that early on Sunday, so I get to take Sunday off. But from there, the most important kind of process that I have, and it's something that has really developed over years. I call it GTD because it's kind of its core basis was David Allen's Getting Things Done, which I read years ago, but it's really evolved kind of a long ways from there. And what I will do, I actually have a checklist in Evernote, and even though I do the same thing every day, I follow the stinking checklist. And I have a couple of email accounts. So every email account goes to inbox 0, and I kind of put things in organizational folders. And I have kind of some ways I operate from there. So I will have an action folder. And part of this process is I'll look through the action folder and I will move items that I think I can get to today to a today folder. So I have a very much more limited view of like, okay, here's the actionable stuff. And then I have a waiting for folder. So if somebody owes me a reply, that kind of helps me follow up on things where somebody else has dropped a ball.
Right.
I also review my calendar. I confirm all of my appointments because there's nothing worse in my world than I'm sitting on a WebEx and somebody doesn't show up. Like that's just an extraordinary waste of time. I need to know that that's not going to happen so I can do something productive with that time. So I kind of do that kind of a triage first. That gives me a sense of, okay, how much open time do I have where I can work on some strategic priorities? What fits into those strategic priorities? And that's how the action list gets built. And I also use Todoist.
How long does it take to go through not necessarily doing everything, but going through your email and setting all this stuff up?
It's about I'm also a Pomodoro fan. I don't use it super consistently, but I do around kind of this getting things done process and a couple of other kind of chunks through the day. It takes me about 1.5 Pomodoro. So call it 40 minutes.
Okay.
To go through that and just, so I go through all my voicemails. I go through all of my texts from the last day. I go through all of my notes from the last day to kind of pick up any action items that I might have missed that I didn't kind of capture in the moment. I review my entire account list to sort of look at, okay, are there things, is there something that I can do today that is going to help this particular account? I look at my opportunities. Is there something that I can do today to move this opportunity forward? And so that's kind of the overarching process. And once I do that, like I have got my plan, I am set. I'm not in that just complete space of chaos.
Right.
Like I'm very, very much in control, and I'm getting up so early. Like that's done before I'm starting to get emails from anybody else.
Right.
So it allows me to really stay ahead of the game. But again, talking to the top performers on the podcast, there's others where that's flipped. They have some type of an evening process where they're figuring out, what is my plan for tomorrow? What is my goal for tomorrow? What am I hoping to accomplish? But for me, between working out and kind of getting a good sense of energy from that and going through that process, I'm pretty well set. And then I'm locked down for the rest of it, right? Everything's pretty well calendared. I won't say that it goes completely according to plan, right? But by and large, it gives me that sense of control and helps me. I feel like I probably get more done before noon than most people do in a full day.
Right. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there's something about, especially if you're sort of coming from a technical background and maybe you're still juggling a lot of technical responsibilities or managerial responsibilities and sales and marketing responsibilities, it's easy to thrash and just have your head explode and not get anything productive done. And I think your process, or whatever variant of that people choose to use, but having some process, as you say, is better than nothing.
Exactly.
So at least you know that you're sort of taking control of the things you can take control over. And it may not be everything, but you know, hey, I'm doing what I can, and there's some things out of my control that I'm not going to worry about.
There's many things out of my control.
Right.
Absolutely.
But at least you kind of know that, and you can say, that's out of my control. I'm not going to waste a whole bunch of cycles worrying about something that is completely out of my control. Here's a ton of things I could go do that I actually have some control over. Let me go do those. And I think that was something that was hard for me at the beginning. You know, you send the proposal off or whatever, and then you'd spend so many mental cycles, at least I would, worrying about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like, well, you know, it's okay to think about that for 30 seconds, but it's not okay to think about that for 3 hours and worry about it. Even though it's a really big proposal, it could make your numbers, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Like it's like there's some things that you just can't control until they have the conversation with you to follow up and so on.
Do you just send the proposal and wait?
I used to. That's why I invented the software, because I thought that, gosh, this is a really dumb thing. I would leave those voicemails like, hey, just call them to see if you got the proposal. Right. And I was like, this has got to stop. I'm a technology guy, right? I can fix that problem.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could sell, but I could certainly fix that problem. So let me do that.
Good. That's awesome.
So what else? You got process. Thanks for the very specific tips. I appreciate you being a good sport when I'm quizzing you, just like you quiz your guests.
It's only fair.
I feel like that's the awesome thing that I really enjoy about your podcast. What else should people take away from what you've learned, both in your personal experience and from talking to these top performers?
You know, I think the thing we haven't talked about enough is just the relationship side of things. The way, one of the things that I'm still trying to validate, and I haven't had enough guests on the podcast yet who have been number one for a really long time. Mm-hmm. And I've absolutely seen this, right? Where there's somebody who's just been number one. They've been there for the last 12 years in a row. Nobody can possibly find a way to unseat them.
Right.
And I have a theory about that. And this is a theory that I've had about sales success for a very long time, and something that I'm kind of trying to follow in where I've the position that I've put myself in my current career is it comes down to sometimes I'm a cyclist, not so much right now, but to borrow a derogatory cycling term, it's TITS, which stands for time in the saddle. Because if you look at cycling success, like you kind of have to ride for like 8 or 10 hours a week before you're really going to be able to sort of break through and start to do the interesting stuff. Like you just have to.
Reason I'll never be a great cyclist.
you just have to put in the work. Well, I think that applies to the uber successful salespeople where they've been in the same industry, ideally with the same company in the same territory. And they benefit from, and they can't have just had those things. They also have to have been doing the right things for a long time. And when they do that, they benefit from a lot of amazing things. They have this huge number of relationships with all of these clients that they've worked with and work with. And that becomes a source of referrals, of references, of frankly just new opportunities because of movement. Mm-hmm. I mean, people change jobs so often. Well, if I was able to help you with this company and now you just took on a new role, you took one more step up a rung in the ladder, you moved to a new company.
Right.
We're going to do it again. And so I think there's a lot of that goes on, and being in a position to really proactively manage those relationships. And actually the sponsor of my show, funny relationship stories. I actually have two sponsors of my show. One is a company called Nudge, and Nudge is they're just about to rebrand, but I don't want to jump the gun. But the whole name won't change. It'll still be Nudge. But Nudge, they are really trying to take artificial intelligence to look at and understand the strength of your relationships, and also kind of suggest when you need to be back in touch with people, and different tools and content and articles and things like that you can use to get back in touch with people. So a tool that I use every day, it's free. So I'll use my own little podcast plug here. If you go to top1.fm/nudge, it'll actually take you straight to their website, and you can kind of sign up and get an account. That's awesome because it hooks into LinkedIn, it hooks into my calendar, so it'll actually know, oh, well, your relationship with Ruben is pretty good because you spent an hour together here and you've been trading these emails, and it'll tell me in a while, like, hey, Scott, you haven't been in touch with Ruben in a while, right? So that's a pretty neat tool. And just whatever you can do to be proactive and nurture those relationships. There's so much power that comes from that. Something I haven't delved into enough with my guests, but that I have some suspicions around, is just the overall level of trust, right? We do business with people that we like and we trust, and finding ways to kind of accelerate that trust. And there's no better way to accelerate that trust if, one, it's already there, right? Because we've done business before, or we've worked together before, or we have, some semblance of relationship. So even though this is the first time we've been face to face, we've been communicating for months and adding value for each other. So this doesn't feel brand new. I think there's already a level of trust.
And I'm just going to interrupt you for a second and say that's because you went way out of your way to be super helpful for no good reason other than that you like being helpful. So you're living some of the principles that you talk about.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. But then the next level is then being introduced, right? Well, if you trust me, would you be willing to make an introduction to somebody that is that perfect fit for me based on my niche and right, all of those other things that we've kind of talked about? So, I think those things, at the end of the day, though, it comes to understanding and leveraging your strengths. What is it about you that makes you special, that is going to add the most value to the person at the other end of the table, and use that. That's what's going to make the difference, and help you get where you want to be.
Awesome. Great advice, Scott. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Cheers. Wait, no, fill that back up.
I can't fill it back up. I've got to drive home.
You can't cheers an empty glass.
I know.
Put something in there.
All right. Here we go. Cheers.